Hello. Thank you very much for joining me today. How are you? Welcome to this contentious episode where we're talking about immigration. Ooh, very controversial, scary. Even in a country, made up of immigrants. Ooh, it's scary, immigration. It is a pretty difficult issue. I think it's a complicated issue. A lot of people try to make it seem very simple. Shut down the borders. Let's just close down the borders. I think it's pretty complicated. And it seems pretty screwed up here in America. The whole system kind of seems screwed up. It seems almost impossible to become a U.S. citizen. But it's more easy to just illegally get into America than legally, it seems like. Some years there's more people that come into America illegally than there are people that legally become citizens. Seems odd. The law that broke U.S. immigration. So this title caught my eye. By Vox, a small and up-and-coming YouTube channel. Check them out. 12 million subscribers. Why the U.S. has so many undocumented immigrants. Interesting.
When Americans turned on their TVs in the early 1990s, one contentious issue was hard to
When times were simpler.
miss: immigration.
Is immigration good for America?
The federal government won't stop them at the border.
You spend $5.5 billion a year to support.
Man, times haven't really changed that much, have they? You still turn on the TV and see this.
There's a right way and there's a wrong way.
At the time, there were around 5 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. And most Americans saw immigrants as a burden on the country, taking jobs, housing, and healthcare, and thought immigration as a whole should be decreased.
Our country is invaded by immigrants who are like cancer cells.
Cancer cells. Man, there's a little too much fear about it all, I feel like, on the subject of immigration.
That same year, Republicans ran
Cancer cells.
on a tough-on-immigration platform and took control of Congress. Democrats were pushed to adopt tough positions on immigration, too.
We are a nation of immigrants, but we are also a nation of laws.
In 1996, President Bill Clinton signed a major piece of legislation, the illegal...
It is kind of an interesting, it's kind of like a contradictory concept to have a free nation where freedom is like a central, at least in theory, thing about the nation. But then, what do you do about the borders? People want to come here. Are they free to come here? We all came here. Our ancestors came here. But now you're going to close down the borders. You're going to restrict people from coming here. But you kind of have to, because if you just had them completely open, obviously that would be a logistical nightmare. But then again, for a long time, the borders were relatively open. And we survived. It's an interesting subject, I think.
Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, or IIRIRA. Its goal was to decrease the number of undocumented immigrants. It did the opposite.
Damn.
Before the 1990s, undocumented immigration into the U.S. looked very different. For one, it was usually temporary.
People used to go back and forth across the border. They would go north and, for the harvest, and they would earn some money, and they would go back to Mexico.
That feels like such a foreign concept. That's very interesting. That actually feels like it's kind of good for both economies, potentially. During the harvest, America gets a little extra labor. It's like seasonality. It's like, I don't know if companies do this in other countries, but during the fourth quarter of the year, when Black Friday and Christmas is all happening, all the companies hire a bunch of temporary workers, then they're all gone come the new year. It makes sense. And then it's a cheaper standard of living, so you can come up here to America, earn some money, go back to Mexico. Cheaper standard of living, so you can, make quite a lot of money, spend it down there. It kind of makes sense.
And if they wanted to come live permanently in the U.S., there were a few legal channels, but not many. If they married an American citizen, they could get lawful status. Or if maybe their brother was a citizen already, he could sponsor them. Or an employer could. And these could be done after they were already living in the U.S. undocumented.
Oh, wow.
Before 1996, the threat of deportation was relatively low. People were commonly deported for committing a crime. And it was mostly limited to major crimes like murder or trafficking.
That certainly makes sense.
But IIRIRA, together with other 1996 laws, drastically expanded deportable crimes to even minor infractions like shoplifting.
Shoplifting? I don't know. I do kind of have a problem with thieves in general, even if it's just something small, but that's kind of like a values thing fundamentally. I see gambling here. That's a little bit smaller of a crime, in my opinion, than shoplifting. But shoplifting, it's like, also it depends on how old you are and also what you're shoplifting and your circumstances. You know what I mean? Once again, it's kind of a complicated issue. Things can be a little bit, not so black and white. It's like if you're shoplifting a bag of rice because your children need to eat, I'm not going to be too upset. Like, you know what I mean? That's not nearly the crime of stealing a cell phone.
It was also retroactive. So say it's 1976 and someone is caught stealing some albums from the mall. They wouldn't be deported. Over the next 20 years, they never commit another crime. But after 1996, they could be deported because of that old misdemeanor.
What? That's stupid.
And not just if they were currently undocumented. This applied to immigrants with lawful status too.
What? What? You're telling me you spent your whole life built up and actually became, built a whole life here in America and then you became a legal citizen. And because you shoplifted 20 years ago. Wow, that's wild.
Too. And previously, an immigration judge could decide if the deportation should even take place. Now things were a little more automatic.
Ignoring the fact that those deportations would be extremely harmful to U.S. citizen children or to spouses.
Deportations skyrocketed, and IIRIRA created the framework for future laws that further expanded reasons people could be deported, especially after 9/11. But IIRIRA also made another huge fundamental...
Man, 9/11 really changed the entire political landscape over here in America, really, in terms of security, privacy, expectations of privacy, immigration, just all sorts of things. It sucks. I hate that ever happened.
Especially after 9/11. But IIRIRA also made another huge fundamental change in the U.S. immigration system.
One of the aspects of the 1996 law that is particularly strict and I think in many respects inhumane is the so-called 3 and 10 year bars.
Those 3 and 10 year bars made these legal pathways nearly impossible to obtain. They work like this. Anyone who's been undocumented in the U.S. for 6 months and wants to gain legal status first has to leave the country and be barred from returning for 3 years. If they've been undocumented for more than a year, they're barred for 10 years. So if they...
But what? How would you know they were undocumented? You know what I mean? Couldn't you just leave the country and pretend you were never here and then apply?
If they want to get lawful status through a job, they first have to leave the U.S. for 10 years. Or through their brother, leave for 10 years.
10 years? Forget that.
Or through their spouse, leave for 10 years.
It's family separation by another name. The bars were intended to try to essentially create punishments that were so severe to deter people essentially from coming here. But as we've seen with many other deterrence-based policies, the practical effect is very different.
Instead, it incentivized people to stay in the U.S. undocumented. Before IIRIRA, Mexican immigrants who came to the U.S. unlawfully were about 50% likely to return to Mexico within a year. But after 1996, more people started staying in the U.S.
Oh my God. Did it really drop from 50% to like 1%? Holy crap.
There were around 5 million undocumented immigrants living at the U.S. before IIRIRA. Today, it's at least double that.
And we are somehow surprised by this outcome. This is
The one interesting thing about the number of undocumented immigrants is also that it hasn't really increased.
It's at least double.
I'll let that graph fill out. Like, it's still around here. I think it's like at 12 million. Oh my God, what is going on? It's still around 12 million, like in 2024. If you just watched the news, you'd think that there must be like, that the number must be doubling every year. But it's really been like pretty flat. Because they've been deporting a bunch of people, and, you know, that's a part of the reason. But still, the cumulative number of illegal immigrants at any given time hasn't changed much since 2005.
Double that.
And we are somehow surprised by this outcome. This is of our own doing.
Laws like IIRIRA shaped the way the U.S. focuses on immigration enforcement as a deterrent. But really, it proved that stronger enforcement doesn't actually stop undocumented immigration.
These laws.
You know, I feel like people who don't live in America might be interested to, like, to know just how prevalent, like, in everyday life, it's very obvious when you see undocumented immigrants, and not to, like, stereotype them or anything, but they tend to do these certain laborers jobs, you know, like roof repair or like harvesting crops. And, you know, you'll see them all the time, like in big groups. And it's like an open secret. It's kind of odd. Like everybody knows they're there. It's kind of interesting to me. I don't have a problem with it, to be honest. I mean, I think they do. They're very hardworking people, most of them.
The politics of the 90s didn't really change the reasons why people come to the United States.
Today, views on...
But I will say, the biggest counterpoint to that to me is that there's a lot of people trying to come here legally, and it's kind of messed up that, like, so many people come here illegally. And, you know, the people who are trying to come here legally are stuck trying to do it for years. Meanwhile, people do it illegally just to like it's nothing. You know, the system is pretty screwed up in that way.
On immigrants are very different than they were in the 1990s. Most Americans now see them as a strength, not a burden.
Wow.
But the laws created here haven't changed.
Requirements and standards that were created decades ago that aren't responsive to our needs as a nation, they certainly aren't responsive to the needs of immigrant populations.
The idea that if we only had more guns...
And also, I guess, another major thing is that being an undocumented immigrant, I assume you don't pay any taxes other than, like, sales tax. That's, like, a problem. I guess you're also not voting, but you are using public infrastructure. It's a complicated issue.
We only built a higher wall that would solve all the problems. I think we learned from 96 that's not the way it works. It's not that simple.
I like that guy. He seemed intelligent. You know what? I'm nominating this guy for president. He's better than our two options currently. This guy, I don't even know his name. I nominate him. 2024. That was interesting. Interesting subject. And I know immigration is also a very contentious issue all across Europe right now, too. I'm going to be looking more into that. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Goodbye.